Welcome back to the show. As always, we've got Erik Meier on from EAM Consultants, the legendary, the world leader in sales training, right? If you are in charge of training for your group, if you're in charge of sales, if you're in charge of getting the big one, getting the big deal, you want to listen to this podcast. If you haven't listened to the entire series yet, you want to make sure you're listening to the series because we put a lot of great tidbits in here on how to make the big sale, how to make great relationships with clients that will last forever. Erik, I'm grateful to have you on the show. Welcome back.
Thank you, Anthony. Always great to be here. Looking forward to another conversation. Excited.
Well, today we're talking about fulfillment and the post-sale and getting to the close, right? To start to really, we've kind of talked about buyers and their process, their orientation, right? We've kind of set up understanding the buyer and where they go during the process, right? And now we're going to kind of continue on with how to get through the sale part of it. And now we're heading towards what we're calling the fulfillment and post-sale, getting into closing of the sale, right?
Yes.
And these are all part of, this is not something that you're born with. Look, I was not born. I did not come out going, mommy, I want to close the sale, right? I did not come out going, I'm looking for food and I want to learn how to do sale, right? This is all stuff that great salespeople have learned. Some have had it clearly articulated. Some learned through practice and repetition. But this is all stuff that in order to be a great salesperson, or in charge of making sales for your organization, this is stuff I have to learn, right?
Yep, absolutely. And when we think about closing the sale, it might be good to think about it too. If we've run this process the right way, it really is an anticlimactic moment, which is going to be a little contrarian, I think, for many people who sell for a living. The biggest pressure is when I finally go for the ask, right, without a process like we've been talking about. And so, look, if that's the part that you love, you probably don't want to learn the system because it kind of goes away if you're doing it the right way, right? It's kind of like an anti-close close. So if we walk all the way through, like you were sharing, with that buyer-seller system, we want to understand it, not participate in it. But the most important part is to not start it, right? The sellers, I think, are often guilty of engaging that buyer system. So we want to work this process we've been talking about so we don't even have to deal with it to begin with. We set good upfront contracts. We establish relationships. We've got mutual agreement on where we're at and where we're headed. We understand pain, budget, the decision-making process. And we set a framework for this meeting here that'll be called the fulfillment meeting. And we're going to talk about this interaction called post-selling, which is kind of after we've agreed to work together. And so if we've done all that stuff correctly, by the time we get to fulfillment, that's what it is. It's fulfilling. It's fulfilling and sharing what's going to solve the pain that has been mutually agreed to and understood through the conversation. It's going to be fulfilling a solution to that pain within the mutually agreed to budgets. We talked about that being money, effort, accountability, and time. TEAM is an acronym. It's going to be mutually agreeing to fulfill the decision-making criteria that's been discussed. Who needs to be involved? What do they need to hear, see, feel, experience? How do they want that shared and presented? And, it's all kind of framed in this upfront contract where we've agreed in advance on decisions that we're comfortable making. One of them is no, right? The alternative to that is some version of yes and progression. So if we've done all that stuff and we show up here fulfilling pain within the capacity to invest in alignment with the decision-making process, the only thing left to do is to share a solution and ask if someone wants it. All right. And, if you think about traditionally the problems that sellers run into there, Anthony, you could maybe help me with this, but let's say the traditional presentation, right? A seller goes in with a solution, they share the solution, they haven't done the things we've been talking about, and then they get the roadblocks and objections that really make their job difficult. And I'll start you off. Here's one that I'll see. They finally get to that point, they share a solution, they put that presentation in front, they describe it, and then they say, are you ready to get started? And the prospect says, well, we've got some things to think about, right? And so, all right, there's a huge objection late stage. Now, if they were following the Sandler process, they would have understood what the decision-making process was and fulfilled the obligations of it. So that wouldn't fit. They would have also had upfront contracts. So we would have already agreed in advance on what yeses and nos comfortably would look like. So think it over doesn't really fit there.
It doesn't. And I want to go back a little bit. So in the old school way of thinking, right, a lot of times, in Sandler training, you're really building a long-term fulfilling mutual agreement or mutual understanding between two groups, right? It's a lot different than the old school talk them into something and then ultimately have a bad relationship at the start type of selling, right? So what I've really noticed the distinct difference as I've gone through the training with you is that this is really building very fulfilling, very long-term relationships right from the start. And you're really listening in a way that I've never heard sales training done before. This is great listening, a great way of really building a trust, understanding their needs, understanding how to meet their needs, and how to work with them as we go forward. It really does build on these items. So by the time we get to this end, we're not in a spot that leaves people feeling empty and lifeless.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's the traditional version is I hit you over the head, you hit me back. We do that a couple of times. One of us gives up, right? And then maybe you get a deal, but that's not a great way to start the relationship, Anthony, right? Especially if we want to build one for the long term. And so all those objections or roadblocks, we're preemptively getting in front of them. The idea of having to think about it, that means we didn't understand the decision process. We missed that conversation. Having something be outside of the scope of what they can invest in, that means we didn't hit the budget conversation, right? Sharing a solution and hearing things like, we've tried stuff like that before. I don't think it's going to work in our industry. Well, that means we didn't understand pain. So all of those problems that run into that traditional presentation step of a sales conversation, they just go away, right? In most cases, again, as you've set this up the right way, by the time that potential buyer shows up to this fulfillment meeting, they are hoping that what they'll see will solve their problem so they can make a good buying decision, buy it, and be able to move on to solve other issues. And that's a good moment, right? We've talked about this before, but I'll repeat it again. People love to buy things. Like, that's a good moment.
That's right. That's right.
You get that nice vest on when you bought that, it solved a problem for you. That was a good day, right?
That's
People
right.
don't like being sold stuff though. And every time that happens, then there's the pushback and then it gets weird. And then they throw up roadblocks and objections, and they should, because there's pressure there, right? So we want to eliminate that pressure. This is a contrarian process, eliminate the pressure, non-event event when it comes time to closing. It should just be a comfortable decision by both parties that was made in the beginning. It's being fulfilled here.
Nice. And that feels a lot healthier, right? It feels a lot more structured, a lot healthier.
Yep.
And, as we set the system up and a lot more fulfilling for our sales reps, right? The people that are doing sales, right? Because they're building these really great relationships where they've actively listened, they've actively participated in the process, and they just become the conduit of having both groups work together in a way that's fulfilling for both sides of it. It's not this pressure-filled idea. Now, oftentimes we self-impose a lot of that stuff on ourselves, right? We have quotas and we have margins we want to make, and there's all kinds of other stuff that comes into play. And we could talk a lot about that stuff on the backside about some of our behaviors, but a lot of that is in how to develop it. Let's get right into closing and really, audience, I want you guys to get. Let's follow right along here. I really want you to get the steps so you've gone through these other parts of the buildup, and let's get into this next part of it, Erik.
Yeah. So if we're laying out, what's a good fulfillment meeting going to look like? There's a couple of things that we want to do if we're thinking of a process and just aligning it back to that process again, Anthony. So, it's pretty common that there's a little bit of time in between maybe the last conversation you had and now getting together to share the information now that you got to share in this fulfillment meeting. And depending on the length of the sales cycle, that might be a day or two, it might be a week or two, just to get everyone back together again. So remember, there's been some time that's passed. One of my favorite openings to that, just to make sure that we're not going to get in trouble, is to start off by, ensuring nothing really drastic has changed. So after a couple of pleasantries, good to see you again, I just dropped this question in there. And I might say, hey, Anthony, I was looking forward to getting together today. Before we dive into it, anything change in your world since the last time we got together that we should start with, because it's got an impact on what we had agreed to do last time we met? And just kind of start with there. And I'll tell you, Anthony, in the 13 years I've been doing this, on 5 separate occasions, the company was sold in between the last meeting we had and getting together to this one, right?
I've had the same thing happen. I literally sat down at the table. We're ready to put this deal together. Yeah. Hundreds of other projects, and 7 days earlier, we had an agreement in the middle of that 7-day return. the company got sold, dramatic things changed.
Dramatic changes, right? You could have key executives leave. You could have new people promoted in that have an opinion. Like there's all sorts of stuff. So it's important before you really start diving in, just ask, has anything changed we should start with? Do we want to back up and just talk that through before we get rock and rolling? So always good to start with that. You never know what's changed until you've asked. If nothing has changed, then we just want to get into reviewing where we've been and what we're here to do, and then move forward from that point. So a nice little review maybe of the upfront contract we set for the meeting. If we've agreed in advance that today's the day we're going to make some decisions, you might look at what I've bought and prepared and shared with you, and it's not the right fit. If that's the case, are you still comfortable telling me no? Get confirmation on that. If that's not the case, are you comfortable telling me yes, and we'll get started today? Comfortable on that. And again, if we follow the steps and we understand pain, budget, and decision, we've covered enough ground where those should be the only two decisions left. I'm going to see what you came with. I'm going to decide if I want it, or I'll decide if I don't. And that's fair, right? So we make sure we've got that reset and established.
And what this means to me is when I work with somebody who talks that way to me,
Mm-hmm.
I figure that they're going to run my projects that way as well.
Yeah.
Right. That they're actually thoughtful enough to look through and understand that there's a proper way to create programs. For us in the construction world, that these are the type of people that they're not faking it. They're actually creating a great program authentically, right?
Yeah.
These are the people that I want to run the programs.
Anthony, can I throw something out? Because I get goosebumps hearing that, right? So two things. One, I had a session with a client earlier today even, and the comment from them, they've been working with me for a couple of years, was that they have the best clients they've ever had in the history of that company because of what you just said. The way they onboard them through this process, it's a different relationship. It's one of mutual respect and accountability. It's a totally different client when you onboard them that way, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing was, how they're respected differently in that conversation too. And I think that's important for every seller to consider. Not only are they being interviewed for whatever product or service they're going to sell, but they're also being interviewed to a large degree. Does that buyer, see how you navigate this conversation? Because they're trying to figure out, how are you going to manage subs? How are you going to manage contractors? How are you get right in your world? Those would be some of those other conversations. If they can't handle this prospect conversation cleanly and fluidly, they're going to screw those up too, right?
That's right.
And so, it's not just about the product or service they're buying the seller to a large degree, and they're looking out for that. So I love that you made that comment, because I think that's a key part of this too, right? So we start by reviewing that. And again, for everyone listening, it's not about setting that contract for the first time. It's reviewing it, right? That upfront contract was established at the end of the last meeting in preparation for this meeting. So all we're doing is reviewing it again, making sure nothing's changed. We're both comfortable with it. We're on the same page. And if that's the case, good. Now we can go back in, maybe just a quick download on what's been discussed to make sure that's correct too. Here was the pain we talked about. This is the budget we talked about. Here's the decision criteria we talked about. Everything good there? Good. If it's good, we keep moving. If it's not, we want to deal with it before we start presenting and sharing. But assuming that's all fine, then you just get into the presentation. And here's where I tell clients and anyone listening, this is where you just be you, right? Talk about the things you want to talk about, share the information you need to share, present it in a way that's hopefully, good for your audience and captivating. But that's on you, right? Know your stuff, be able to talk about it cleanly and fluidly. This is your part, right? Now, there's a couple of things that might happen in that conversation. So maybe I could just share some highlights to think about. Let's say you've got multiple decision makers. And this was one that I remember learning, Anthony, and I didn't know at first where it would fall in until I had a chance to utilize it. But if you've got multiple decision makers, I think a seller is always trying to figure out, where's everyone at, right? If I'm sharing this information, we're 30 minutes in, where's my audience at, right? Just check in with them. And it's a simple technique. It's called the thermometer. Call it a scale of 1 to 10 exercise. So maybe I've got two buyers. One of them is my champion. The other one, I'm not so sure. And so I'll go to my champion first and say, hey, Sally, on a scale of 1 to 10, we covered a lot of ground here in the last 30 minutes. 10 would be, we've talked enough about what we're going to do for you. You get where it's going to fit in. You understand how it solves the issue. You kind of want to get started. I don't need to share anymore. That's like a 10. One would be, we've talked about a lot of stuff and I'm really missing the mark and we should probably wind it down. It's going to be a no. Where are you at, Sally? Right? And just let Sally benchmark it. Right? She'll say she's an 8, a 9, a 10, a 7, whatever the number is. And now we've got that. Now we can move to the other parties and say, hey, same question. Where are you guys at? And as we get that number, what we can do is ask what else they still need to hear, see, feel, and experience so they can decide to be a 10 or a 1. And now we've got a roadmap, right? Here's what needs to be talked about that hasn't been talked about. I think that's one of those challenges is a seller comes in and they've got this pre-canned idea of what's going to be discussed. And they're going, they're sharing, they're presenting, they're going from slide to slide, Anthony, and they've lost the audience.
Lost them. You've talked too much. By the way, I'm raising my hand. I've been in those sales where I just think I'm going to babble them with my BS. Yep. And I'm going to present so much information, such a value proposition that they can't say no, right? And sometimes I've gone too far.
Absolutely. And, I've had some fun stories with this, good clients that became good clients in this moment, 2, 3, 4, 5 decision makers. And, the pressure of the seller, I think, is to try to convince those audiences to come along. If you're using this scale of 1 to 10, you let them duke it out with each other. So you go to the person who's likely to give you the highest score, and then you work your way through the room. If you've got one person who's a 5 on that buying team and one person who's a 10, ask them to discuss it with each other, see if one of them's right or wrong, and just step back, right? If you've got the right politically influential people on your side, they will figure out how to get everyone in the room to a 10, and you got a deal, right?
That's right.
And if not, then we weren't talking to the right decision makers. So get a lesson and come back and do it differently the next time, right? But at some point in there, to your point and your comment there, you can talk yourself out of a deal. That is absolutely something sellers will do. It's very difficult to listen your way out of one. So at some point, just kind of check in, test the temperature, and see where it's at. And then, Anthony, there's this big anticlimactic moment as you're getting to the end of however much time you set aside for the conversation. You've covered the ground you needed to cover, and you simply say, what would you like to do next?
There you go.
And if we had a strong upfront contract, we followed this process, we answered the questions, we understood the pain budget decision. What do you like to do next? The answer is, how do we get started?
Right. How do we get started? Right. Let's start figuring out the onboarding process.
Yep. And so again, anticlimactic, let the buyers decide they're ready to buy, ask them what they'd like to do next. They'll let you know that it's time to go. You never have to close again, right? You never have to close again. And I think that's a very comfortable start to this relationship. Like you mentioned before, better clients will start showing up, not because they just got better, but because sellers managing the conversation, onboard them better, produces better clients.
Yeah, there you go. We're producing way better clients. That's what I think a lot of people aren't hearing. And this is where salespeople sometimes, I've been with those salespeople who I just want to make a deal. Let the company figure out what they got to do with it, right? Yeah. I'm just going to get a deal. And some companies, when they set up organizations or salespeople, they motivate or incentivize them the wrong way. We're not looking for customers. We're looking for customers that fit for us as a company.
Absolutely. And you don't want to get that reputation as a seller. I mean, I had a great client that we worked with, a recruiting firm, and the worst seller on their team was the person who was constantly doing that. Hey, let's take this deal. They got a couple of openings. They'd push and they'd force it, and then they'd hand it off to other recruiters who would see that the opening come across their desk and go, it's Bob's again. I'm not doing that. Bob just pushes these things in, and no one ever hires the candidates we send. We're not going to work on it anymore, right? Eventually, that's the reputation the seller gets there, and the commissions will fall to the side over time because of it, right?
Yep. Perfect.
So we don't want them kicking and screaming. We want them comfortably agreeing. That's kind of how that fulfillment process should go. Now, it can still end in a no, right? I want to be super clear about that. You may do your best to run this process. You come up with a great solution you think is a good fit. You share it, and it's just not what they wanted to see, right? And if that's the case, it's okay. Comfortably, we can shake hands, call it a no here. There may be another opportunity that we can pursue at a later date, and you're back to bonding and rapport again. But if it's done well, Anthony, on average, it should be well north of a 90% conversion ratio for this type of fulfillment meeting. It's preordained.
Even the ones that I've been to this point with many of deals, yep, that for some reason or other, budgets or something changed or something happened during the process that changed. But the buyer knows that I'm authentic, mm-hmm, knows that I'm a relationship builder, knows that we're here. And if this now moment doesn't work, right? Even if we don't close at the time we're at this final stage, or we don't close on what we agree to, maybe we try something different. Yep. We have to do a trial, or we have to set something else up, or there's always something that can go wrong or change. And what I want to do is really build that rapport, right? A trusted person, that trust report. Without, sometimes as a salesperson, we get mad and we shut it off,
Yep.
and we lose it forever.
Absolutely. And when you think about that system again, step one is bonding and rapport. Step two is upfront contracts. So if you get to the no, that was part of your upfront contracts. That just means the upfront contract's been consummated with a no. So that just means you're back to bonding and rapport, and you're building that relationship for the next opportunity to establish a new upfront contract. And always thinking about that, right? It's a linear process. It's moving forward. Where it hits the roadblock, you move it all the way back to where you need to go to start it again. And it's okay. It'll happen sometimes, but it shouldn't happen often, right? If you're running this the right way, this should be a low pressure conversation. If we're going to get no's, you get them in decision, you get them in budget, you get them in pain, you get them early on with your established upfront contract. All that should happen early. By the time we get here, we should be trying to figure out how to work together, not if.
There you go.
Yep. And then, you've got the rest of this relationship now. So, it's kind of like, what does the dog do when it catches the fire truck finally, right? Chasing this thing around, and here you've got it in your jaws, and now you're holding on to the bumper. What do you do next? So I think too often, sellers will get overly enthusiastic here. They get these happy ears. So they hear a yes, they cross their fingers, they hope everything's going to work out fine. They shake hands, they move on to something else. And they're missing some really important key elements as to how this relationship is going to kick off appropriately.
That's right.
Yep. And so this post-sell, if we kind of shift over to that one, Anthony, the post-sell is really now, how are we going to manage forward, right? And there's a couple of key elements, I think, to the post-sale. So one of them is really, how are you preparing this new client to go back and engage in their environment? Whether it's a small deal, it's a huge deal, complex deal, it doesn't matter. If someone agrees to buy something from you, it's very likely, probably 100% likely, they will have to defend that decision to someone at some point.
That's right.
Right? It could be a spouse, it could be a business partner, it could be someone from a different department who is going to use that budget, whatever it is. They're going to have to go back and defend this decision at some point. And so we want to make sure we prepared them appropriately for it. So you've got two problems that we want to be on the lookout for. One of them is called vendor vengeance. The other one is called buyer's remorse. Right?
That's right.
Yeah, and it can be really easy to avoid them out of fear that if I address it, it's going to be something that shows up. The deal I just won is going to fall apart. But it's not. If you don't address it, typically it will come up anyway. You just didn't get in front of it, and then it does fall apart. So the buyer's remorse problem looks like this. We got Amazon now. Everyone can buy anything on Amazon, and if you get it and you don't want it after you bought it, even if it fits you right and it was the thing you said you wanted to buy, what do you do with it?
Take it back.
You just send it back, right?
That's right.
And so that's buyer's remorse, right? In the B2B world, it could be that someone agrees to get started, but they have a difference of opinion, or they get worried about the decision they made, or whatever it is. And you get that Dear John letter or email that says, hey, we're going to go in a different direction, even if they said yes. And so, buyer's remorse is a real issue and challenge. And then there's vendor vengeance. Vendor vengeance would be your win is someone else's loss, right? So with vendor vengeance, if a seller is displacing an organization that does what they do, well, there's probably going to be a call coming into that new client, and the call is going to be from the old vendor. They're going to find out what happened, and they're not typically going to just let it go, Anthony. Fair?
No. That's right.
And we know what the strategies are, right? I've been on the opposite side of that before. I'm sure you've been on the opposite. It's like, hey, don't leave. We'll cut your contract requirement by half, or whatever it is, right? It's like anything you can do to not lose this client is the strategy for vendor vengeance, right? So we want to make sure that we're getting in front of that too. And what I'm really advocating for is you just practice it with the person, right? Just run through it. Here's where, remember, it's science on one side. We've been talking about that, but it's also a little bit of art on the other side, which is this kind of gut feeling everyone gets in a conversation. So you may have picked up maybe on something that hasn't been fully addressed, right? There was a comment about a business partner that wasn't involved in this decision we just made. There was a comment about, something that just wasn't really fully addressed. It's either going to cause for vendor vengeance or it's going to cause for buyer's remorse. Address it, right? Tackle the elephant in the room. I had a client actually. Can I share a story with you?
Yeah.
So this is one of my good go-tos for this one, right? Great client of mine, been a client for north of a decade now. So when he and I first agreed to work together, he had just started a financial office or financial services office. He had branched down on his own. He was doing well, but he was in his early 30s. He had some big ambitions. He wanted to get to a certain number, and he thought, you know what, doing it on my own isn't going to get me there. I want to hire some professional help. And so we ended up having a conversation together. We got through the fulfillment meeting, and he agreed to get started as a client. But Anthony, he had shared through the course of our conversations a couple of things that were like left fully uncovered, right? So one of them was his wife was pregnant and expecting twins. They were going to start their family, right? He had made this leap to running his own office maybe 2 years prior to, so he was still kind of in that learning how to, manage the cash flow environment, all that kind of stuff, right? He had also agreed to have his wife leave the workforce. She was going to stay home, be a stay-at-home mom. So they went from 2 incomes to 1, right?
Wow.
And they had just bought their first big boy house, and their expenses had increased kind of dramatically in the last couple of months. So if you're hearing that story, Anthony, what do you think might happen when this client went home to go tell his wife what he had agreed to do?
Yeah, you've got some real questions and real concerns.
Absolutely. And rightfully so, right? Now that could be with a spouse, it could be with a business partner, again, it could be someone else in another department, whatever it is, again, you're going to have to go back to defend it. So I had heard this stuff, but we hadn't really cleared the air on it. So I just said, hey, let's run through it real quick. There's a scenario I'm thinking about. I'm kind of concerned that you might go home today and, maybe over dinner, it comes out that you agreed to get started working with us. And it wasn't a small investment. It was a 5-figure investment. And I said, you might get some pushback, right? So I'm curious, if you're asked these questions, how are you prepared to defend against the decision you just told me you were willing to make? And, he ran through a couple of different scenarios, and I liked what he said. And I asked him, do you believe that that's true? And he said, yeah, I believe it's true. And he came to training like 2 weeks later, Anthony, with this big grin on his face. Guess what happened when he got home that night?
Same exact questions.
Yeah, right. Very similar questions popped up. He had prepared with me how he was going to respond. And he kind of, he remembered what he said to me, and he wanted to be a man of his word. And so he said it back there in that conversation real time. And I think if we don't prepare our clients for that, we hang them out to dry there, right?
Yeah. And look, and I think that once we get to that fulfillment stage, right, we're ready to put the deal together. This is the sale is just beginning,
Yep.
right? For us, I look at it as a multi-prong. Now we want to embed ourselves into the program, right?
Yep.
Embed ourselves into a system. We want to build a long-term, and what we start looking at is, excuse me, the multiple places where things could go wrong, right? Like it doesn't make sense for us to, because during the sale we had to negotiate. There was some people that wanted one company, some people wanted another company, and now the one who wanted us to win and they won. There were some people that the other people may have wanted to win, and those could be our sabotage. They could sabotage our whole program, and we got to start really looking at. We heard that, we may even saw that during our presentations. We could even feel that during some of the conversations. Now, the way I look at it is our teams have to split up a little bit, and we try to build bridges across to those different people, right? Really make sure that the person that was not, who didn't vote for us at first, right? We're paying special attention to that person and not neglecting that, because that could be one of those long-term sabotageurs for the system. And I want to make sure that, someone on the team is taking responsibility for communicating with that person robustly. Right.
Yeah.
We try to do a 3 or 4 prong approach. So one person's working on that. Another person's working on the accounting team, right? Someone who goes into the finance and accounting team, because look, it doesn't make sense for us to put this whole system together if our contracts take forever, our pay applications go in, if we don't know how to get processed and all that stuff to go through that. If we don't get into that, we're gonna have a disaster very quickly, right? Our people will mess something up, or we'll do something wrong, and those people that were shooting against us will have some ammo. Oh, you see, they're messing up on their expense reports, or see, there's something. They'll use that as fodder to cause a little sabotage. So, getting in and building relationships with the other parts of the organization. So we take our head of accounting, make sure they get into they get into those relationships and deep dive into how do we make pay applications? How do we process payments? When do we pay? What's the agreement on all these triggers, so that those don't become a real problem later on.
Absolutely. And, you take some of that stuff too, Anthony, and that's a great example of what should be addressed, in the beginning of the budget step, right? And so now we can take that information, because that's effort and accountability. And now you can start to really attach that to this post sell. How are we going to tackle that going forward? And you think again linearly about the sub, right? So if we've gotten to that post-sale side, now we're really back again to bonding and rapport and developing the strength of that relationship. So who else do we need to do that with that wasn't tied to this conversation? Is it finance? Is it legal? Is it these other spaces, right?
That's right. That's right.
And then building upfront contracts around how we're going to begin those relationships. And I think this is one of those other keys to a clean post-sell. There's always something, if you get a prospect to become a client, they agree to work on a project together, there's always going to be a next step, right? Because something's going to kick off. And I think too often too, the sellers will leave that meeting where they've agreed to get started without calendaring that first next step.
Ooh.
So it's right back into chase mode again,
That's right?
Right back into chase. So before you wrap that meeting up, if we've shaken hands and we said, hey, let's get going on it, always having something locked in as a calendared next step for both parties. Now that could just be to confirm homework assignments have been completed. It can be to confirm kickoff dates. It can be to confirm fill in blank. But from that point forward, on average, every 2 to 4 weeks, something should be scheduled with that client as a touch point, regularly scheduled, making sure there's good, clean communication. And, the thing that happens with that too, Anthony, and you know this, your world is commoditized just as much as my world's commoditized. For anyone who doesn't think they're commoditized, by the way, ask your buyers what they think, right?
That's right.
We're all special and unique until the buyer says, well, I actually have options. And so to some degree, we're all commoditized in the buyer's eyes. And what's the biggest differentiator, if that's the case? It's communication, right?
That's right. That relationship, communication, that authentic piece. Exactly what you're going.
And so I think about that communication. I couldn't tell you how many times I've heard people talk about how great their customer service is because they'll be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's fine, except if you had great customer service, you wouldn't have to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because that's putting out fires, right? Yeah. So if you had really good customer service, you would have scheduled interaction where you'd otherwise have unscheduled interaction. No phone tag, right? We'd have regular downloads. We'd stay in constant contact. We'd both be communicating appropriately and effectively with calendared interaction. So, that post-sell should give us a chance to start that off. And again, you start to picture, how does this become a better client? Well, that's just how people learn to respond and react in the relationship. If the seller prepares that relationship to be calendared interaction, a client's more likely to appreciate, respect that, and actually like it, right? There's nothing worse than unscheduled stuff, right?
I feel like when we do it really, really well, we're the best example on their team, right? When we interact with customers, especially as a consultant, we become the example that the person that hires us uses, right?
Yep.
We calendar our communications. We set up a process. We set up we really have an intentional onboarding process. We bring in our team. We create a flow chart and a narrative and deliverables and timing. We set expectation very clearly. Hey, you're going to do this, then we're going to do this by this date with this form, and people know exactly where we're at. I find when we have these fuzzy agreements, oh, thanks, we're going to manage that project for you, and we don't engage in, when I say nth degree type of coordination, right? Somewhere someone gets a little grumpy, and it leaves the group, leaves the group feeling lifeless or without energy. When we walk in and we're really intentional, and they watch us, look, hey Bob, it's great. We're ready to come on board with you. Let's set a time for an onboarding meeting. My guess is it's going to probably take us, 2 or 3 weeks to put that together. What does it look like? What do these weeks look like on your calendar? Because we're probably going to need, 2 days to put that together. Yep. And Bob or Betty or whoever we're dealing with will say, great, let's look at this week. Oh, I'm on vacation. Yeah, let's wait till you get back. Here's what we'll do. We'll start setting up an itinerary and agenda for that. And they'll really start to see that when we get there, we're really intentional about how we are on board. And they can see that we're bringing people in, and we're going to understand creating a real great narrative. And again, that flow chart, so we know exactly what we're doing. Mm-hmm. Here's the process step. Here's a responsible party. Here's the deliverable, and here's a by when, right? So that everybody kind of feels that.
Absolutely, Anthony. Right. I love that you said that. I might actually steal it from you if it's okay with you. I think the message that I heard there, which I totally support, I love, is, regardless of whatever you sell, that client should look to the way you've managed that conversation and think to themselves, we can be better, right? I really liked what happened here. We should be adopting these principles. If you're doing it that way, you're doing it the right way, right? And so we want to make sure we've got some good, clean upfront contracts to carry the conversations forward. And then there's just one last piece that sounds super simple, but it might be just a good thing for everyone to hear again. As part of your post-sale process, asking for referrals and introductions, right?
There you go.
Just, absolutely asking for referrals and introductions. Every seller's got a time in their life where they've got to cold call, they've got to pound the phones, they've got to do the grind so that they can get a book of business up and running. But when you've got your first happy client, that should start to minimize if you manage that relationship well and you ask for good referrals and introductions. And I think there's a hesitation, and I'll speak to the mirror for myself on it. I know one of my big roadblocks with asking for referrals, Anthony, was if I did that, it was, maybe it meant I couldn't find my own business, right? And so that was a weird one. I had to work my way through that head trash. But, the other part was, I've got to wait until I add value and then I can ask. So I can't do it when they agree to get started. I've got to wait until some random months from now where I can go back and say, hey, now that we've proven some value, maybe I can ask you for an introduction. When a client becomes a client, they trust you enough to spend money. They trust you enough to solve that problem together. They should trust you enough to make an introduction to someone else they know that can have a conversation they enjoyed as much as they had with you. And so asking at that point of conception, I think, is absolutely okay. And certainly asking after you've delivered value is very much a secondary okay.
I think it becomes a natural, right? And we had another step in there where we set up intentional follow-up meetings with our business development folks, with the customer, to go back in and go, all right, look, we had a month, it's been a month since we've been on board. What are we doing right? Let's go back and look at what's the 10% that you love about us? What's the 10% that maybe we need to change about us? Right? Let's talk about those really authentically, because look, my job is to be that conduit for you. And at that conversation, when they see us really do that, right, it might be a great time for you to go back and re-engage for that referral, right? Some of the people you've worked with in the past, any of the programs that you left, since you just got on board here, the place you just left, what happened there? What was the problem? And you can tell, well, they were a mess. They need something like this. Great. Would you mind giving an introduction to me, or would it be a great time to do that? I think it's a natural place to go if you're doing the authentic, and really, look, that's what I want our business development people doing. I want our business development people checking in and make sure that, we're not missing something, because sometimes we're going so fast on the operations side that you may be missing something you need to hear.
Absolutely. And I think humans are kind of wired to that to some degree, Anthony. They'll celebrate the wins together, but when there's potentially a problem or something a client is unhappy with, unless the sales side is willing to ask for it comfortably, they may not hear about it until it's too late, right? And at that point, it's hard to kind of walk backwards on. So we want to eliminate that fear. And we'll talk about that too maybe in a future session. We can go through the care model, which is really about account management, right? Now we kind of work down that account management process. Give you a quick insight into it. One of them is called nurture calls. I think nurture calls are just key. If you've got accounts that don't require a lot of hand holding, right? They maybe renew regularly, they call when they need something, right? Or they call when there's a problem. But over time, that really becomes the relationship. And so the only time we're talking to each other is when they've got an issue they need, to be solved, or there's something that they want from us, or vice versa. And so a nurture call sprinkled in between is huge for the relational value. And it would just sound like this. I would call you maybe out of the blue, scheduled for me. I'd put it in my CRM system, but it'd be unscheduled for you, Anthony. And it would be, something like this. Hey, Anthony, I was just thinking about you. Want to give you a call. Didn't need anything. Hope you're having a good day. Halloween's coming up. What are the kids dressed at this year, right? And it's just, it's something else outside of I need something from you or you want something from me, right? I think it's important to remember that. Everyone's got a family member or a friend that they haven't had conversations with outside of needing something. And they start to recognize at some point, I almost hesitate to call them because I know in my heart, that's all I ever do when I call them, right? And I think sellers suffer the same thing if they're not nurturing that relationship in between.
Well, that's great relationships. Great business development people build great relationships in our community, right? They become a very, for us, they become a big fish in a small pond by building trusted relationships. Hey, we're going to bring our warriors to fight your battle for you, right? And they become part of a system that the buyer can count on. Thanks, Bob, for bringing your warriors over. They're doing a great job,
Yep.
right? I did a post a follow up the other day with a guy that I'm really great friends, become really great friends with because of the sales, and he's like, man, this woman you have on our program is the best in class. Anthony, she's the example for the rest of our people, and that
Mm-hmm.
just felt great. Great. Look, what can I do? What can I do to make sure that? Do you need more? Any place else? Do you need anything else that we can do? Do you want any forms that we're using? You're happy to share those with you for the rest of your group, right? Not here. Look, use this or not use this, but here, how can we continue to grow and benefit and something you can count on from us?
Absolutely. And Anthony, I mean, even being a nationwide organization, you probably found that the bigger you got and the farther your reach, the smaller the community became to some degree, right?
That's right.
And reputation matters. And doing this deal, like we've been talking about, is one thing, but how we handle it going forward will make a huge difference in someone's success or failure as a career in selling. And maybe that's one of the most important things for us to talk about. It's not about doing the deal. It's about what do you do afterwards? How do you nurture it? How do you manage it? How do you add additional value? Do they leave it with wow service and excitement for doing future deals? Right.
That's right. That's right. Well, good. As we get to so we've now got to the end. We're of closing. Right
Mhm.
now, we've got the deal over there. Now we're onboarding, right? And we're continuing to check and make sure that during the onboarding process, nothing got missed in the promise that we made.
Yep.
Or if we sometimes there needs to be some adjustments. Sometimes we put a deal together and there needs to be some adjustments to the deal that was made. Oftentimes we'll find out, we'll get on there and they'll be like, well, look, we got you managing projects, but someone didn't talk about, we have no one who's managing our vendors. Some of our projects are failing because we don't have a vendor manager or we don't have someone managing that part of the process. And that might be something that's a great opportunity for us to go put somebody else in the program for them, right? Another way for us to make an investment in them as an organization and bring some, and fulfill that for the entire organization. Hey, let us help you put that together. Or sometimes we'll take our onboarding paperwork and our flow chart, our narrative, right, and the deliverables and timing, and we'll put that together in a way that they can use for their whole organization, right? Not just for us, but for their whole department.
Absolutely. And it's building on it, Anthony, at that point, right? And that's where that value comes from. So we want to make sure we've gone through those steps. This is a kind of an accordion too, if you can think about that. We talked about 7 steps, and for anyone listening, going, well, Erik, I've got a 3-year sales cycle. I've got plenty of clients that have long sales cycles. It's just an accordion. The bonding and rapport might take a couple of meetings to work through together appropriately. You might have to set multiple upfront contracts. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different paying conversations with different people from different departments. Budget conversation might require 2 or 3 meetings to hammer out, right? It's about expanding and contracting it to fit the constraints ultimately of what that sales cycle requires. But you're either in the steps or you're in the buyer system. And I think that's the key there for everyone to be listening to.
Awesome. As we start to look forward, and we keep getting into more and more parts of the sales training process. Erik, let's kind of project forward some other opportunities, some things we're going to look at. So I really want the guests to get excited about, we've gone through a big part of the process and kind of where we're heading, right? So I want them to really see that this is not just, these couple of steps, but now we're going to start to really articulate, more refined parts of sales training.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's all sorts of stuff that we can layer on with that, Anthony. There's, taking care of the clients. We started to talk about that. There's behaviors, which is how do you build what we call a cookbook, this plan for going out and executing, interacting with potential clients. What's that look like? Every seller should have a cookbook built there. We're going to talk about attitude. And often belief systems, attitudes, what we believe is some of the bigger challenge in the way. And if you can think about it as what we call the BAT triangle, behavior, attitude, and technique, this whole system we've been talking about so far is very much technique driven so far, right? But these behaviors, so what do we have to do to get in front of prospects and potential clients? What's that look like? So we'll talk that through. And then again, that attitude side, what's our belief system conceptually? What's in the way? What's the head trash, right? How do we manage that and build the toolkit for that side of it?
Exciting stuff. Audience, as always, we are working hard on building a program for you and your business development folks. Erik, as always, it's a gift to have you on this show. We love doing what we love having you on, and the practice and the training that you bring to us. It's a wonderful experience. So I'm so grateful to have you.
Thank you, Anthony. Looking forward to our next conversation. Appreciate you.
I appreciate you back. Audience, as always, thanks for listening.